Hi everybody, it's Mr. Schaber and welcome to our presentation on World War I and the World War I era. Uh, we're going to talk, a lot about the war itself, of course, and kind of the lead up to the war, what touched off the war. This is just an enormous event, not only in U.S. history, of course, but in world history. And it really, as you'll see, set the stage for World War II. Okay, how World War I played out and how it ended up really lead to World War II down the road. And of course, we know what World War II has led to, which is our modern day. And so World War I really kind of sets the stage for the 20th century and really into the 21st century that we're in now. So let's look at this. But first, I have a couple of questions for you. Up until today, what is the most important or life-changing day in your life and why? And think about that for just a minute because we all have life-changing days during the course of our existence. We all have probably multiple times that steer us in a different direction in life, for better or worse, and things that affect us for good or bad. But I want you to think about that for a second. All right, let's move to the next question. What is the most important day in United States history since 1900 and why? To me, this is really interesting because if you asked 100 different people, you'd probably get a different 100 different answers. But and any answer that people could come up with obviously is important to them, or they think it's important uh, in the context of U.S. history. But I'm going to tell you today why perhaps the most important date in U.S. history, perhaps in since 1900, uh, was June 28th, 1914. Okay, and it's debatable, but we're going to look at this. What is the most important day in world history since 1900? I just asked you about U.S. history. What about world history? Well, again, I'm going to make an argument that perhaps it's June 28th, 1914. And you may be wondering, what the heck happened June 28th, 1914? Why would that be so important? I've never heard of that before. Well, uh, you may or may not have heard of it, but let's get into it. And the last question before we really start delving into World War I is war ever justified? If not, why? And if so, under what conditions? Something to think about. And that's something that you're probably not going to come up with a real deep answer in just a few seconds. But I ask these questions to kind of get them into your head as we start this discussion. The story of World War I really, I'm not going to say gets started with, but really comes to a head with Archduke Francis Ferdinand. And so let's understand a little bit about this guy and understand kind of how the war got going because it all centers around him. An archduke is a title of nobility, of royalty. And in this case, Archduke Francis Ferdinand was the next in line to be the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria and Hungary today are two separate countries, but back then they were they were part of an empire, and that empire, as you will see on the map I show you in a while, it included parts of modern day Bosnia and Croatia, and it had Transylvania in it, and it had the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So it was a pretty big empire. Anyway, the Archduke grew up in the royal family. He was used to being treated like that, and he liked it. He loved the red carpet treatment. But he also kind of went against tradition in one major way. You know, the royal game back then was tennis, and he was down playing tennis one day as a young man. And as he was playing, he, of course, set his pocket watch and his other things off to the side. of the court while he was playing. Well, his mom came down to watch him, and she was curious. She picked up his pocket watch. Back then, all the men wore pocket watches, and of course, when you opened them up, on one side was the clock, and the other side was usually an empty circle. So it became customary for guys to put a picture of their significant other, their girlfriend or their wife, in that other side of the pocket watch. And so the Archduke's mother picked up his pocket watch and opened it up, fully expecting to see a picture of the Archduke's cousin, because he was supposed to marry his cousin. That was very customary back then. As weird as it sounds, that was very customary back then for royal families to do that, to keep what they thought to keep the royal bloodlines pure. Of course, we know that it would do anything but that. But a lot of marriages were arranged, of course, between royal families of different nations to form alliances and so forth, but also a lot of marrying of cousins and so forth occurred. And so he was supposed to marry his cousin, and his mom opens up his pocket watch and does not see a picture of his cousin in it. In fact, it's a girl that she doesn't even recognize. And she says, Franz, people close to him called him Franz. Franz, could you come here for a minute? I have a question for you. He comes over. Yeah, what's up? What's going on, Mom? She says, well, I'm a little confused. Uh, this isn't your cousin. Who is this girl? And he said, Mom, I was going to tell you, but this is a girl named Sophie. I'm going to marry Sophie. Well, is Sophie royalty? No, Mom. She's of Czechoslovakian descent. She's a common girl, and but I'm in love with her, and that's who I want to marry. And his mother just kind of freaks out. Says, "Well, you can't do that. You're supposed to marry your cousin and all this stuff." And the mom, goes to her brother, who was the emperor at the time, Franz Joseph, and says, "Well, what are we going to do? Francis Ferdinand wants to marry this common Czech girl, and well, what's going to happen? And well, what do you think?" And so the emperor thinks about it for a minute, and he says, here's what we'll do. When I die, Francis Ferdinand will still become the emperor. He's next in line to be emperor. He'll still be the emperor. But if he marries this Sophie and they have kids, then their kids will forfeit all right to the throne when he, Francis Ferdinand, is gone. And we'll take this to him and see if he agrees to this. And so they proposed this, and he absolutely still agreed. He says, yep, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to marry Sophie, and my kids, if they don't have a right to the throne, so be it, but I'm marrying Sophie. So he did. And in this picture on the right there, it's Franz and Sophie and two of their kids. They would eventually have a third. But Franz and Sophie get married on June 28th. It's an important day. June 28th, 1900. And as the years go on, they have their three kids, and Franz was a great husband to Sophie. He was a great dad to the kids. He loved to get down and play with the kids, and sometimes he'd get visited by other royalty from around Europe, and they'd walk in, and he's wrestling with his kids and playing on the ground and not acting very regal, not acting very royal always, but he didn't care. He was a good family man, and he loved his family. But he was always bitter about how his extended family treated his wife. Because she wasn't royalty by birth, they really they really looked down upon her. In fact, they'd have these big royal processions or banquets, and they'd literally roll out the red carpet and have the double doors to walk through, and you would go through in order of your quote unquote importance in the empire. So the emperor went first, and the archduke went second, and so forth, all the way down to the kids at the end. Well, when they would have these big royal processions, Sophie was forced to walk at the very, very end of the line after all the kids. And when she would come through the double doors, they would shut one of them. It was almost kind of a slap in the face, like, you're not as good as us. And so he always resented how his wife was treated. So anyway, the year of 1914 rolls around. It's summertime. And late spring, early summer. And the emperor, Franz Ferdinand's uncle, comes to him and says, hey, I want you to go on a routine city and military checkup down in Sarajevo, Bosnia, part of our empire. I just want you to go and just check on things and, make sure everything's good. And you can decide exactly what day you're going to go and so forth, but that's what I want you to do. He says, okay, great, sounds good. So he thinks about it, Franz Ferdinand does, and he thinks, hey, wait a minute, I'll go on June 28th, my wedding anniversary. It'll be my 14th wedding anniversary. I'll take Sophie, my wife. She's never been treated real well. She's never been treated like a queen or an empress. And she's going to be the next empress, right? When Franz Ferdinand becomes the emperor. And so she's never been treated like that. I want her to be treated really well. And he knows that when he pulls into town in his motorcade, that people will be lined up along the streets and will be cheering and excited to see him. At least most of the Bosnians would be excited to see them, and they would, wave and cheer for Sophie, and she would be treated well. And it was going to be kind of an anniversary present for her. And that's how Franz Ferdinand saw it. So he says, "Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. June 28th, Sunday morning, June 28th, and we're going to go to Sarajevo." And so great, he's got his plans. Well, the plans are announced in the newspaper, and most Bosnians are excited about that, being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to see their Archduke. But some are not excited. In fact, one group who's not excited are some Bosnian nationalists and some Serbian friends of theirs who have joined a gang. These are kind of disillusioned, disaffectioned, late teens, early 20s, and they form a group called the Black Hand. And these kids are just looking for trouble. And so they read about how the Archduke's planning on coming to Sarajevo, and they decide that on that Sunday morning they're going to assassinate the Archduke. And so they start, making their homemade bombs and getting guns together and develop a plan. Well, anyway, the day comes, and the Archduke and Sophie come into town in their motorcade, 6 cars that they had in the motorcade, and of course open air convertibles. And they come down the main street of Sarajevo, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people lined up along the streets, both sides of the street, to see them and wave and cheer and so forth. Well, the members of the Black Hand are intermixed with the crowd. And the first member of the Black Hand, closest to where the Archduke's motorcade is approaching, has a homemade bomb. And he tosses it, hoping that people won't, there's so many people, he's hoping he can kind of conceal it and people won't know who threw it, but he tosses it at the Archduke's car. Well, it ends up blowing up, a minor explosion, behind the third car. The Archduke's in the second car with his wife, and the third car gets the little explosion. It's a homemade bomb, so it's not super powerful, but a jolt. And the cars aren't moving that fast, but a couple of the security guards on that third car get knocked off the car and off the side, where they were hanging on, and they suffer some minor cuts and scrapes. And instead of just flooring it and getting out of there, like you probably should have done, the Archduke says, "Whoa, whoa, stop the motorcade, stop the motorcade." And so they stop the motorcade, and he gets out and he checks on his security guards and sees what happened. And he says, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. You guys are going to go to the hospital just right down the street here from where we came into town. And I'm going to go to town hall and see the mayor, which was kind of the purpose of the visit. I'm going to visit with the mayor. And then, after an hour or two, whatever, visit with the mayor, we'll come back and pick you up at the hospital and we'll get out of town." Well, the head chauffeur doesn't hear this, and that'll come into play later. But so anyway, this Black Hand member who threw the bomb starts to get pointed out by people in the crowd, and the policemen are after him. So this guy runs down a hill toward the river bottoms, and as he gets down there, just before the police get to him, the police will later say they saw him take something out of his pocket, and he looks like he's drinking something. And sure enough, it was a vial that was supposed to be filled with poison. The Black Hand members had decided that if any of them were about to get caught, they would drink the poison and die rather than being caught and interrogated and have to spill the beans on the plot and who was involved and so forth. So this guy drinks this poison, but by the time the police get to him, he's not dead. Rather, the poison just made him really sick. It didn't kill him, and the kid's just throwing up down at the river bottoms. And so the police apprehend him. Well, the other members of the Black Hand, seeing this, have realized that their plan for the day, this long conceived plan, is down the drain. It's not going to work. And so they all scatter, thinking that their friend's going to rat them out. They all scatter, that is, except for one. One of the boys stays around, and he goes to a cafe on the side of the road, and he's going to go in there and sulk, thinking about what might have been. Okay, this young man's name is Gavrilo Principe, and you'll see him in just a minute. But uh, Gavrilo Principe goes into this cafe and sulks and mopes while the Archduke is meeting with the mayor of the city. Well, after the meeting is over, they get back in the motorcade, and the Archduke wants to go back to the hospital on the main road to pick up his security guards, but the head chauffeur had planned on leaving town a different way than they came in for security reasons, which is smart to do. And he turns up a corner, up a road, heading out of town a different direction, and the road he turned up just happened to be the road where the cafe is facing. And so he turns up this road, and the Archduke sees what's going on and says, "Whoa, whoa, stop the motorcade, stop the motorcade. We need to go back to the hospital on this main road and pick up the security guards before we head out of town." And the head chauffeur said, "Oh, I didn't know that, and I'm just going a different way, like we should." And literally now they have to stop all their cars before they can back everything up. And the Archduke and his wife's car is literally stopped, sitting there right in front of the cafe. Well, Gavrilo Princip, this young Bosnian nationalist, uh, looks up. He had previously thought that all their plans were destroyed and that all was lost. He looks up, he sees the Archduke and his wife sitting in their car, literally 20 feet from him. Okay, and he gets up, he walks out the door of the cafe, he pulls out his gun, and from point blank range, he fires 2 shots. Before he could get a third shot off, he's attacked by. There's tons of people still around, so he is wrestled to the ground by some onlookers, and the gun's beaten out of his hand, and then he's arrested by the police. But the damage is done. Those 2 shots hit their targets. The first one hits Sophie in the stomach. The second shot hits the Archduke in the neck. And they're both doubled over. Now they really are going to the hospital, and the chauffeur and their driver rushes them to the hospital. And while they're still conscious, the Archduke says to Sophie, "Sophie, you can't die. You must live for our kids. You got to live." And she says, "I will." And she doesn't live. She dies. And then the Archduke is bleeding to death out of his neck, and so they put some compression on his neck with rags and shirts and things, and they rush him into the hospital onto a little bed in a little room with white walls. And the story goes, when they took the pressure off, they took the compression off, the blood just squirted out, and the Archduke bled to death and died. And so the 14th wedding anniversary for the Archduke and his wife started out great and ended tragically. Gavrilo Princip, for his part, was always sickly. He would die in prison shortly after this happens. But like I said, the damage is done, and the Archduke and his wife are now dead. You may be thinking, well, how in the world could a world war start from something like this? Okay, well, you will see that these nations that eventually get involved were all just kind of itching to go to war anyway, and they were looking for a spark, something to happen to do that. And this assassination of the Archduke is exactly that event. And so the Archduke and his wife are dead. Their children are now parentless. And a tragic, tragic event, which will lead to the death, literally, of around 10 million people within 4 years. So that is how World War I gets, well, that is the background of how it gets going. That's what happens to the Archduke. And you will see then coming up how one country will accuse another country, and then another country joins in, and another country joins in, and pretty soon alliances are formed and a war breaks out. So this happens on June 28th, 1914. Okay, and within 1 month exactly, World War I would begin. All right, so I just told you the story of the Archduke. Well, looking at this map, then you can see what the Austro-Hungarian Empire looked like. The Archduke, of course, like we said, was second in line to be the emperor, and he was down there in Sarajevo toward the bottom. But you can see how big, like I said, like we previously mentioned, how big this empire was. It was very large in modern day terms. But all these events happened down in Sarajevo, Bosnia, modern day Bosnia. Now let's look at the kid who did this. I've already mentioned him, Gavrilo Princip, but let's look at him. So here he is. I mentioned he was from Bosnia. He really wanted Bosnia to be independent and free. He did not like Bosnia controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so he and some other, there were plenty of other people that thought this way as well, but they weren't going to shoot the Archduke over it. Okay, but he was, he had some mental issues and he wasn't all there. And he was always, I think I mentioned this, he was sickly, and after this event, after he shoots the Archduke and Sophie, within a fairly short time, he would die in prison. But the damage is done. Again, the damage is done. What he has done, what Princip has done, has really led to kind of the final straw uh, among these European countries who were already at each other's throats to go to war. And so, again, you're thinking, well, really, the assassination of an archduke is going to lead to a world war? Well, yes. At the end of the day, yes, because we'll look at the map again here in a second, because now you will see, like, you'll see which countries, aligned with which other countries, against which countries, and you'll see kind of how the thing rollerballs until there's no turning back, and the First World War is inevitable. So here is the Austro-Hungarian Empire again, but as you see the map, what ends up happening is Austria-Hungary is so irate at what has occurred down in Sarajevo, they blame the country of Serbia for this, a neighboring country. They blame Serbia for this and said, your government put this black hand up to this whole thing. You guys are behind this. We know you conspired to do this. And Serbia can't believe it. Like, no, we didn't do anything of the sort. We have nothing to do with these crazy guys in the Black Hand. They're on their own. They acted independently, and we had nothing to do with it. And Austria-Hungary's not buying it, and they said, no, we don't believe that. We know you're behind it. They had to have somebody to blame, right? And so they blame Serbia and says, hey, Serbia, we're going to declare war on you, basically. Okay, we're going to annihilate you, wipe you out because of this. Well, Serbia, and reasonably so, is panicked and says, we didn't. First of all, we didn't do this. Second of all, we're going to get annihilated. And so they said, we need help. And so they appeal to their Slavic cousin, okay, Russia. They say, Russia, Austria-Hungary's blaming us for something we didn't do. They're gonna wipe us out. You got to have our back. And Russia says, yeah, we have your back. We have your back. Now Austria-Hungary looks at this and says, oh my goodness, Russia is involved. We're going to get annihilated now. Russia will cream us. And so Austria-Hungary appeals to help to their Germanic brother, Germany. Okay, Austria-Hungary says, "Hey, brother, we speak the same language. Basically, we're same blood running through our veins. We need your help. Russia and Serbia have teamed up, and they're going to crush us. Do you have our back?" And Germany says, "Yes, we have your back." And so you can see how the sides are forming, the teams are forming, the alliances are happening, and because Germany jumped in now on the side of Austria-Hungary, and Russia is involved. Well, England and France had made deals with Russia prior to this, and long story short, England and France jump in on Russia and Serbia's side, and so now you have these teams that have been created, and they're going to go after each other. Okay, and so this all happens very quickly after the assassination of the Archduke and his wife, and within a month, in fact, exactly a month, July 28th, 1914, World War I will begin. And these alliances are at each other trying to annihilate each other. Now you're saying, though, wait a minute, how could the assassination do all this? Well, the answer lies in that These countries were already at each other's throats. They were already revved up for different reasons. For nationalistic reasons, they each thought they were better than the other. Um, they were building up militaries, trying to be superior to each other. There were overseas colonies at stake here, and wealth, of course, economics always plays a part. And so these countries were already kind of ramping up to go to war. They were just looking for one major incident to occur to lead them to war. And the assassination was that incident. The assassination was the match, okay, on the ammunition pile. And so that's what happened. All right. So the result is what we call the Great War, or what we call World War One, really. But the Great War is how the newspapers of the day and how the people of the day called it, because there was no World War Two yet. Okay, it was just so there was no World War One. It was the Great War. Great meaning huge, big, enormous. Eventually, a lot of countries, besides just the ones I mentioned. Now, the ones I mentioned were the major players at first. Eventually, the U.S. would join, but not yet. But eventually, many countries would be joining this war in different capacities. Some just economically, some would send soldiers, some would send supplies. But a lot of countries are going to be involved in this great war, which of course we, like I said, call World War One. World War One got its name only after there was a World War Two. Okay, but this war goes for 4 years, 4 long bloody years, and it's going to be unlike anything this world has seen. Okay, up to that point. When the war first starts on July 28th, 1914, Germany is the dominant power. Of all the countries that jumped in, Germany was militarily the strongest. And so they kind of assume control with that alliance with Austria-Hungary, even though Austria-Hungary really started the whole thing. Germany kind of assumes control over that alliance, and we'll look at what that is in just a minute. But um, most people think this war is going to be over in 6 months. It's not going to be a huge war. It's just going to be over in 6 months. It's going to be a glorious thing to be a part of. It's going to be, and so, when you're young and you think you're invincible, and it's going to be a glorious war, it might be the only war you ever involved in, and you're already on edge in your respective country because of all the things that are going on in Europe. I mean, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids joined this war in mass. A whole generation of French and British and German and Austro-Hungarian and Russian youth and others join this war thinking they're going to go and fight and defeat the enemy and come home heroes, right? Well, Germany has a plan to win this war quickly. And the plan is called the Schlieffen Plan, named after their general. And their plan is they're going to march through Belgium and through Luxembourg into France, and they're in their different divisions of men in their army, and they are going to outflank the French and conquer Paris, conquer France, and any English that try to come over to help the French are going to be annihilated, and they will win quickly on that western front, the western part of the war, because you have Russia involved as well, which would be the eastern front. But on the western front, with France and England coming over to help, Germany plans to defeat them quickly using this Schlieffen plan. Okay, well, as the Germans try to execute this plan, they do storm through Belgium and Luxembourg into France, but they don't get quite as far as Paris. In fact, uh, they never reach Paris. It's there that the French and the British put up more resistance than the Germans thought they would get. And they end up reaching kind of a stalemate, okay, which we'll talk about. And when they reach a stalemate, that's kind of a situation where neither side is winning. Both sides are kind of just locking horns at that point, and neither side can really push the other one back. And that's when World War One on the Western Front will take its shape. So this war that's supposed to be over by Christmas, 6 month war, will go for 4 years, and it will not be this glorious war that these young men thought they were getting into. It will be bloody and brutal and horrible and cold and hot and uncomfortable and everything a war is that the young men did not anticipate. And whole generations of youth throughout these countries that are involved will be annihilated, shaping the world, okay? Shaping family dynamics, shaping national dynamics in ways different than any country anticipated. So let's continue. The two sides in this war then are called these: the Central Powers, appropriately named because they're kind of in the center. Okay, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy would join them as well. Turkey would join later on and play a role as well over in Asia, Eurasia, right, kind of right there in far, far Eastern Europe. But Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy are the Central Powers. The Allies, as they're called, are Great Britain, France, Russia, and then the U.S. and Serbia, of course, will be part of this as well. The U.S. will join later. But you can see, well, who should have, I mean, on paper and by the map, geographically, who should have had the advantage, you would think would be the Allies, because you have Russia on in the east and France and Britain in the west, and they kind of have the Central Powers sandwiched in, right? But because Germany was so strong militarily, uh, it doesn't quite work out that way. And it's not a quick war on either side, not a quick victory for either side, obviously, and it is going to be just a horrific, horrific war. I told you that the Germans, with their Schlieffen plan, got close to Paris, but they never captured Paris, and therefore, being stopped by the British and the French there outside of Paris, and reaching a stalemate, neither side able to knock the other one back and budge the other one. What ends up resulting is both sides put down their guns and they will start digging. And they dig, and they dig, and they dig this system, this elaborate system of trenches deep into the earth. They dig trenches that are 6 feet deep and 6 to 8 feet wide in many cases. And they dig them for hundreds of miles throughout France and Belgium. And this is going to be the Western Front, and trench warfare will be the way the war is fought on the Western Front. Okay, and these soldiers will live in these trenches and die in these trenches. They will eat and go to the bathroom and sleep in these trenches. And occasionally they will run out of these trenches and charge toward the enemy trench system, trying to capture the enemy trenches and defeat the enemy that's in them. And usually they will not be successful in doing that. Occasionally they are successful and they capture some enemy trenches and knock the enemy back a mile or two, or 3 or 4 or 5. But then the enemy eventually would usually regain that territory. And so the trench system and the trenches, the front just doesn't really move much for 4 years on the Western Front in World War I. Now, why trenches? Why is this the way you're going to fight? Well, throughout history, trench warfare has been used quite often. Okay, and so they were familiar with this. The generals were familiar with this style, and so they are going to use this system. But it's also because of something else that trench warfare becomes a preferred system of fighting on the West. Here is a typical German trench system in World War I. You can see, of course, here on the left, they have what's called no man's land. This is the area between the trenches that neither side controls. No man controls it, right? This is the side. This is the area that each side is trying to gain control of by conquering the enemy trenches, right, and advancing, you know, their territory. And so you can see you'd have one side approach the other. You can see all these portrayals of soldiers rushing toward the enemy trenches, but outside the trenches you have barbed wire, which are an obstacle to get through. And then you have your trench system dug in. Of course, landmines are planted throughout no man's land and around the barbed wire. And at this trench system, you would have you'd have some guns set up, and then as you dig back farther in the trench system, you'd put concrete blockhouses for machine guns, and you'd have men as snipers and on their guns throughout these trenches going back. And you can see behind everything, you'd have the long range artillery, your big cannons to shoot artillery shells at the oncoming invading force. You can see how the Germans did it, and of course the French and the British would do this thing as well, where they dig out places underneath, for men to sleep and for hospital, basically to be used as a hospital for guys who got injured. And I mean, this is crazy, right? These things got elaborate, extensive, but you can imagine how much success or lack of success an invading force would have trying to go at an enemy trench when you have landmines, barbed wire, you have machine guns, you have snipers, you have artillery all aimed at you. And then you might have airplanes overhead that could bomb you before you ever got to the barbed wire. Okay? Uh, it was not a very successful endeavor in most cases to charge across no man's land at the enemy trench. This was a suicide mission in many cases, and it's just crazy. But the generals would get impatient and they would blow their whistles, literally, and they would send their men over the top. They called it, get out of your trench, over the top of out of your trench, and run across no man's land and charge the enemy. And they did these over the top charges occasionally, and boy, it was devastating for both sides. Here is actually a bird's eye view from overhead of a system of trenches, of what the ground looked like and still looks like in some cases, right? You can still see pockmarks all over in these places from the trench warfare that existed there during World War One. But I mean, you can see the two sides, right, and how elaborate they were. And of course, they'd be zigzagged, and and almost look like puzzle pieces, right, going around. And you do that obviously because you don't want to make them perfectly straight. You want to make them so that if the enemy does get in a trench and you're retreating, they don't have a straight shot to fire at you, but have to go around corners and bends and things like that. And so, but I mean, think how much time this would have taken to dig, and they're always digging back and farther back and down, and I mean, hundreds of miles. So let's look at some statistics here after we look at this next picture. The blue on the bottom there are the British and French trenches, and the red are the German trenches. But you can see, I mean, just crazy how these like webs, right? Like webs of and mazes of trenches. And this is where these guys lived. If you were on the Western Front, you lived in the trenches. That was your life. So let's look at trench warfare then. This is one way I kind of make sense of this. It says opposing sides dug into a system of trenches. They were cold, wet, and always filthy, and were home to men and rats alike. The trenches were packed with troops, on average one soldier for every 4 inches of front. You know, the rats would come in, they would feed on the dead bodies, the rats would get huge. You had lice, you had fleas. In the wintertime, in the summer, of course, you're too hot because it's hot there in that part of the world. And but you have your wool uniform on, okay? And in the winter, it's too cold, and there's snow and there's ice. And when the trenches get wet, of course, it just turns into mud, and so you're stepping in mud. Of course, dead bodies. You hated to do it, but a lot of times dead bodies were put on the bottom of the trenches so you could step on them instead of the mud. They were put on the tops of the trenches to make the trenches higher so you could peek your head maybe a little farther up without getting hit by a sniper. I mean, these are things that these guys had to deal with day in and day out, okay, for years, some of them. But one soldier for every 4 inches of trench on average. So let's do some math. If the front was about 600 miles long, the Western Front in Belgium and France was about 600 miles long. A mile is 5,280 feet. A foot is 12 inches. We multiply that to get 63,360 inches per mile. That number times 600 miles is 38,016,000 inches of front. And there's one soldier for every 4 inches of front, 4 inches per man. How many men is that? Over 9.5 million men on the Western Front at any given time. Like I said, entire generations okay, of young men from France, from Great Britain, from Germany, from Austria-Hungary, from Russia. Uh, just incredible. Attacks and counterattacks on the Western Front might or might not result in a few yards of territory gained or lost, but certainly resulted in plenty of deaths. On an average day, 2,533 men died on the Western Front. On the average day for 4 years. 9,121 were wounded and another 1,164 were missing, which typically meant they had been blown apart or were no longer identifiable as individuals or even as members of the human race. So basically, that 2,533 men died every day on average for 4 years on the Western Front, and the 1,164 were missing. You could add that number, okay, to the dead, because if you were missing, it pretty much meant you were dead. All right, as I said, then the area between the trenches that neither side controlled is called no man's land, and this is the side. This is the area that both sides are trying to get control of at a given time to push the enemy farther back, right, and then take their system of trenches and push them and continuing to push them back until you defeat them ideally. But neither side could effectively do that throughout these 4 years, and that's why the trench warfare is the name of the game on the Western Front during World War One. Another picture of no man's land. Imagine trying to run through no man's land, right? Like I said, landmines, barbed wire, artillery shells, machine gun fire, sniper bullets, airplanes dropping stuff on you. You had very little chance of surviving and let alone defeating the enemy, right? And that brings us now to a critical part of World War One. Why did so many men die? Why did they use the trench system? How could this be so horrific, okay, of a war? And the answer lies mainly in that all the new weapons, the new technology that were used in World War One were unlike anything ever seen. They were more devastating than anything ever used on the field of battle. And you couple that with the kind of the trench warfare system and that just kind of that technique of using the trenches where men are just kind of stationary and sitting ducks. Uh, I mean, the results are going to be devastating. And so let's look at some of the new weapons in World War One that made this so just unbelievably annihilating for both sides. First, you had the rapid fire machine gun. You can see there, you can put on a tripod. Now, it's not as effective, not as good as the machine guns we have today, but this was, I mean, think about this. The Germans developed this. Eventually, everybody's going to have one, a version of it. But it took two men to control this thing or to maneuver this thing. One guy would be on what they called the belt of the ammunition. You can see, and he would maneuver the bullets into the gun. The other guy would be shooting the gun and aim it to where he needed to aim it and fire the gun. And of course, with machine guns, as long as you're holding down the trigger and you have bullets, the thing's going to fire. That contraption on the front of it is actually a cooling system because the barrels would get so hot. If you didn't have a cooling system set up, the barrels would melt down and the gun would be destroyed. So, but you can imagine setting one of these things up at a concrete blockhouse and just have it trained, have it set on enemy as they're approaching your trenches. I mean, none of them would survive, and very often that's how it worked out. The tank. The tank is going to be a perfect weapon for World War One and a devastating weapon. The British developed the tank. Eventually, other nations will have one as well. But the tank's going to be big tracks, right? Not wheels, but tracks. And the tracks can go over the trenches, and the tank can be, uh, you know, you can try to make it bulletproof and you can armor plate it and things and it can have guns of its own and the tank is going to be so scary of course to if you have a tank coming at you what do you do, right? So the tank's going to be a new weapon in World War One to cause mass carnage. The airplane. Oh, these old World War One airplanes, of course. Airplane technology was kind of still in its infancy during this time, but World War One probably had some of the craziest, best airplane fights of all time. Right? What I wouldn't pay to see those. But you would mount a gun, usually up top, right? You got to be careful not to shoot off your own wing or shoot off your own propeller. Um, but these planes, of course, not like the fighter jets with heat-seeking missiles today, right? And so the pilots had to be really good, and your co-pilot, if he was on the gun, had to be really good. And of course, the pilots sometimes were just up there by themselves with their own sidearm, with their own pistol, trying to shoot down the other plane, right? But these could be used now not only for reconnaissance and to see where the enemy was located, but you could drop, bombs on them, drop weapons on them, and then, of course, mount guns to your own plane to shoot down other planes and shoot down other soldiers. This is going to be extremely effective, and just what a weapon this would be. Poison gas had to be one of the most terrifying weapons of World War I. It was usually mustard gas or chlorine gas. The Germans had developed this. Again, eventually other countries will as well, but uh, it's a perfect weapon for the trenches because you launch it in an artillery shell, it blows up, the gas is released, and the gas is heavier than air. So it's going to go to the lowest possible spot it can find, which are the trenches. And the men who breathed in this stuff, it would burn their eyes, sometimes temporarily blind them or permanently blind them. You can see there in the picture on the right. Uh, but if you breathed it in, chances are you would be dead. And it would not be a nice death. It'd be very violent and a short but violent death because you'd breathe this stuff in and these gases would occupy your lungs. It's heavier than air, so you can't breathe in air. You're choking. And with this gas occupying your lungs, this gas was so potent, powerful. Chlorine, if you've ever been around chlorine, you know that how just the potency of the smell and how it burns, and it's a cleansing agent, like in swimming pools and stuff, but it will just burn up anything. And so chlorine gas, mustard gas, it would get into your lungs and burn up your lungs. And guys can't breathe because they can't get in oxygen because the gas is so heavy. So they start coughing, trying to get air, and meanwhile your insides are literally being burned up and and fallen into pieces. And you heard the phrase coughing up a lung. Well, that is a real thing. It came from World War I, where you'd breathe in this gas, you can't breathe, you start coughing, you're gasping for air, and you cough up pieces of your disintegrated lungs and your insides as you die. I mean, I hate to be that graphic, but that's what happened. That's what poison gas could do. I mean, this is unbelievable. You think about if you saw poison gas, or you think you were seeing poison gas being uh, coming out of an artillery shell when it blew up and coming toward your trench, this was bad news. And so, what did guys have to do? Well, you had to have a gas mask. So gas masks are invented. Right? You put a gas mask on to be able to breathe oxygen and not breathe in the poison gas, and this could save your life. I mean, this is crazy. If you ever wonder where George Lucas got some of his ideas for Star Wars characters, I've often thought it was probably from uh, gas masks. Some of his characters look like that, but uh, I mean, this was an essential after a while, right, on the Western Front. And the heavy artillery. Oh my goodness. For a long time, the world had had cannons. They were old cast iron cannons that were, you could barely move them with 10 guys, but you'd move them around the battlefield and up and down hills and things as armies moved. And they would shoot, the lead cannonballs and stuff. Well, as time does, technology improves with time, and these heavy artillery now shot these huge shells, and they could shoot for miles and miles. Now, not quite around the world like our missiles and rockets today, but these artillery could shoot for miles and miles, and you could annihilate an enemy without even seeing them. With these, if you could be accurate and hit your spots, but or hit the right spot. But these artillery are going to be used, like I said, to soften up no man's land. It's going to create craters all over the place, and it's going to kill enemy as they approach from no man's land. How devastating, right? Zeppelins or blimps, okay, uh, are going to be used in this war as well, mainly for spying on the enemy, for reconnaissance. Now, of course, it's kind of hard to conceal yourself. It's not like the enemy couldn't see you, but you were usually up high enough in a blimp where you could see where the enemy movements were, where their soldiers were stationed, and they couldn't really get you. Now, if they could hit you, sometimes, because these are powered by the gases, to make you, fly in the air, you might just have a big fireball on your hands if you got hit in the wrong spot in a Zeppelin. But you could also use these to drop bombs on the enemy as well. So Zeppelins are going to be it's a German technology at first, and then, like I said, of course, other countries will develop this. But yeah, all these weapons are going to be used to create something we had never seen before, and death on a scale unlike anything ever witnessed. And of course, the U-boat, the Unterseeboot, as the Germans called it, under the water boat, submarine. The submarine that the Germans have, and then eventually, of course, other nations will employ. But the Germans are going to terrify the Allies with the U-boat, because as Allied ships are sailing around, some of them with passengers, some of them with war supplies, some of them with both, submarines can be under the water, and they can shoot torpedoes and hit ships above the water and sink them. And the Allies are getting ships sunk left and right by German U-boats at the beginning of the war, and they can't do anything about it. They're terrified. And so this is going to create a major advantage for Germany, especially on the waters and control of the waters, at least at first. And it's going to create just panic and terror in the minds and hearts of the Allies. And so eventually the Allies are going to have to come up with techniques to try to safeguard against U-boat attacks, but it's easier said than done. Here is a map of World War I, the first half of World War I. Okay, you can see where the Allies are in green, the Central Powers in the purple, neutral countries kind of in the whitish, grayish. You can see where the front line is when the war starts. Okay, kind of the greenish brown line going down through, Austria-Hungary, right? And then 1914-15, the front line is going to be on the east and west, two different places, right? You can see, like I said, 1914, the front line on the east is kind of through Austria-Hungary and stuff. On the west, it's going to be down through Belgium and France. And then as the war continues, the eastern front moves farther east, and the western front also moves farther east, if that makes sense. So the Germans will do some massive damage on the eastern front before the Russians finally knock them back. And on the western front, the Germans will do initial damage, and then the Allies start knocking the Germans back. So this is kind of, for the first couple years of the war, this is how things work out. For the last couple years of the war, this is how things are going to happen. And it's mainly just going to be on the Western front, because you're going to say, well, what happened to the Eastern front? What happened to the Germans against the Russians? Well, we'll talk about that later, but the Russians will eventually get out of the war because of events happening in their homeland. And so the Germans are now, and Austro-Hungarians are now able to focus all their attention on the Western front. And you can see then what happens on the Western front, some of the major battle sites and so forth, but and some of the offensives, right? And then by this time, the Americans are involved. And this is going to be a great boost to the Allies when the Americans get involved, because the Allies are hurting. The French and the British soldiers are, they're exhausted. Those that are left are exhausted. They're running out of supplies. They're war torn, and they need reinforcements. They need help. And the Americans come at the right time to do that. I put this on here. There's a something in German you can see. Looks like I don't know if it's a death certificate or some kind of a deal about that, but you can see kind of the angel of death, right, kind of over the soldier. And then on the right, though, is a real picture, a real photo, and what happened. And that soldier's been there and it's turned into a skeleton. Okay, I mean, crazy. But that's the kind of scenes that you saw in World War I. These were not just made up. These were not staged or choreographed. These are just real scenes out of the war, out of the trenches, and it was gruesome. It was brutal. So let's look at a few posters, propaganda posters from World War One. Kind of interesting, kind of cool. The United States was going to get involved. It looked like we were going to get involved, and of course we did. But posters that have propaganda. What is propaganda? Propaganda basically is advertising that's done in a biased way. It's trying to get you to think a certain way, to buy a certain thing, it's trying to get you to follow an agenda, okay, a bias. And so every country does this when we go to war. They have posters and they spew propaganda on the radio or television nowadays, or you name it, right? Companies do this right through their advertising, trying to get you to buy their product. But in war, it's going to be done, and it's been done very effectively, especially over the last 100 years since World War I, World War II, and other wars. But trying to get you tug at your heartstrings, trying to get you to to jump on board with the war effort and be full bore, in support. And so here you go, ammunition, and remember, bonds buy bullets. So in World War One, the U.S. government started selling what they called bonds. You could go and to a bank or to a place to buy bonds, and you'd give them $20, and they'd give you a $20 certificate, and that would help fund, right? That money would go toward the war effort, and then you'd keep your certificate, and after the war or whenever the bond became due, it might be 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or whatever, whenever it matured, you would take it back, and they would give you your $20 back, or however much your bond was worth, plus interest, because the government needed money now. They didn't need it. They didn't need it later. They needed it now to fund the war effort. So bonds uh, would do that. And so you saw all kinds of posters and propaganda to buy bonds. There you go. And these are real World War One propaganda posters. It is nice in the surf, but what about the men in the trenches? Go and help. Some of these are total like guilt trips, to the young guys. Some of them are um, aimed at the parents. Say, hey, you got to do this for your kids, okay? But they're effective. This is when we see the "I want you" for the U.S. Army. Okay, Uncle Sam pointing at you. That happened in World War One. If the cap fits you, join the army today. Wake up, America. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. Right? There's Lady Liberty, but she's asleep. She's got to wake up for the war effort. Fall in. Answer now in your country's hour of need. Be honest with yourself. Be certain that your so-called reason is not a selfish excuse. Enlist today. Some of these are British. Some of them are American. Okay, there's right. Britons. Okay, join your country's army. God save the king. King wants you, right, for the army. Save a loaf a week. Help win the war. So one thing that you see during wartime, World War II especially, World War I you saw it though, also was conservation efforts. Uh, Maybe you have to eat a little less. You have less products available to buy at the store because products have to be used to feed our troops and help the war effort, right? So conserve, right? Help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. Now the Kaiser is going to be the name of the king of Germany during World War One, but help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser. Buy U.S. government bonds, right? There's the bond advertisement again. Even a dog enlists. Why not you? Right, that's the guilt trip of all, right? Like, hey, your dog could be in the military. Why aren't you in the military, right? Who's absent? Is it you? Right, a British propaganda piece. And of course, some propaganda is aimed at demonizing the enemy. Soldiers eat babies. That's a fact. Think of the children. Join team, what does that say? Demomen today and make those monsters pay. I mean, this is crazy, right? Soldiers do not eat kids, but according to this propaganda poster, they do, and that's a German soldier. Look at those like nails he's got, claws he's got. You have to dehumanize the enemy. You have to make him look like a goblin, right? To justify, uh, you know, defeating them, killing them, right? But soldiers eat babies, they say, so you got to go and save all the babies from the Germans. And then, like I said, some of them are aimed at guilt tripping the parents. This girl sitting on her dad's lap, could be years after the war. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? And hopefully dad has some, patriotic story to tell her, right? You don't want to be the guy who doesn't have anything, great to tell your kids about your efforts in the war, right? So you can see how these propaganda posters worked. Another British poster, your country needs you. Lend your 5 shillings to your country and crush the Germans. Your money is going to help the war effort. All right. Now, who are the leaders of these nations? Well, let's look first at Germany. Kaiser Kaiser Wilhelm. Uh, Kaiser Wilhelm was the product, of course, of European royalty that had been around for centuries. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria. His cousin, who we'll look at in just a minute here, was the Tsar, the Emperor, the King of Russia. Okay, these guys all knew each other. They all hung out when they were kids. They all played together, things like that. But Kaiser Wilhelm is going to be the guy that says, yes, Germany, we are going to fight this war. We have Austria-Hungary's back, and we're going to kind of take the lead, in fact, of the Central Powers. And so he's a tough guy, okay, and he's ready for war. He's not going to shy away from it. In fact, he thinks this is a chance to increase Germany's empire and show how powerful Germany is, how advanced they are, and make Germany kind of the crown jewel of Europe. Well, Kaiser Wilhelm also ordered his U-boats to sink anything they could, they could, and any Allied ship, the British, the French, and eventually, the U.S. goes, hey, wait a minute here, Wilhelm. Some of these ships have been over to the U.S. They have Americans on board that are going to visit family or whatever over in England. And these ships are bound for England, and you can't just be sinking ships that have Americans on board. We're not in this war yet, and we weren't at the time, right? In the first part of the war. And so Kaiser Wilhelm says, okay, we won't sink all these ships, if we have Americans on board, and blah blah blah, right? But eventually he goes back on that promise, and he will just issue what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. He just, okay, guys, sink everything. And one of those boats was called the Lusitania. This is a British passenger ship. It's kind of like a cruise ship, if you will, a British passenger ship sunk by German U-boat in 1915. About 1,200 people on board will die, um, either from the initial explosion or, and more likely, from drowning in the icy cold waters where it sunk. And of those 1,200 people, 128 of them were Americans. And so when the Lusitania is sunk and all these Americans die, Americans start putting pressure on Congress and our president, saying, whoa, wait a minute here. They just kind of got us involved, right? Europe is at war, but they just got us involved. And they're killing our people, and this is uncalled for, and we've got to do something about it. So this is one of the things early on that gets Americans some Americans wanting to go to war. But Woodrow Wilson, our president, who had been elected in 1912, if you remember, and now reelected in 1916, he uses his slogan, he kept us out of war, to get reelected in 1916. He says, I'm not going to get involved in Europe's problems. They're having their own war. It's their deal. Let's stay out of it. And that gets him reelected. But as soon as he gets reelected, uh, he now knows he's in there for another 4 years, and he says, yeah, maybe we should get involved in the war. And so he needs reasons to convince the American people that we should get involved. Of course, the Lusitania got some Americans already on board with that and wanting to go to war. But other things need to happen, Wilson knows, so that he can get the support of the American people. And he gets those things to happen. One of them is the Zimmermann Note. Arthur Zimmermann is Germany's foreign secretary. He writes a letter, an encoded letter to Mexico, encouraging them to help Germany in the war. Mexico, join us, right? We'll defeat the Allies, and then Mexico, you would get back parts of the U.S. Southwest that the U.S. took from you all these years ago, right? Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Okay. The note was intercepted by the British. It's deciphered. It was written in code, sent via Western Union, right? A big American company, but written in code, reportedly deciphered by the British and released to the American public. This outrages the American public when they read this, and it gets more and more Americans on, wanting to join the war effort and wanting to go over to Europe to fight. And so let's look at what the Zimmermann note said when it was deciphered. It says, we intend, now this is Germany speaking, to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the United States of America neutral. So we don't want the Americans getting involved, but we're going to sink any ship they can. In the event of this not succeeding, if the U.S. does get involved, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis. We make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail is left to you. You will inform the president of the above, Germany, right? Most secretly, as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain. So, Mexico, join us. Let us know what you think about this, and we will defeat the U.S. together, and all will be great. All right. Well, that brings us to Tsar Nicholas II, the leader of Russia. Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russian basically mean the same thing. They both derive from the word Caesar, like Julius Caesar. Okay, Caesar, the leader, the great leader, the king, whatever title you want to call it. But Tsar Nicholas II was uh, had been Tsar of Russia for a while, and he had a beautiful family. Of course, his wife, the Tsarina. Okay, and then he had 4 daughters and 1 young son. Well, by early 1917, Russia had been in this war for 2.5 years, and Russia had suffered enormous casualties. As the Germans and Austro-Hungarians on the Eastern Front went into Russia, uh, Russians had almost 2 million people they estimate who had been killed by this time, almost 2.5 million taken prisoner, almost 3 million people were wounded or sick, and the Tsar was becoming very unpopular. Russia had a lot of people and a lot of big military as far as men who could fight, but they were not well equipped and not well organized. And of course, the Tsar takes the blame for this. Well, in March of 1917, he has become so unpopular that he's forced to give up power, and he is forced to basically leave the throne, so to speak. And as a result of this, of course, some of you guys have seen. I have written there Anastasia. That was one of his daughters. Of course, Disney made a movie called Anastasia. The Disney movie, unfortunately, is not too historically accurate, but it's a good show nonetheless. But the Tsar and his family have become so unpopular because of how the war has been conducted, and because so many Russians are suffering and dying, and who else is going to get the blame but the leader, right? But you also have this aspect, and by the way, I think I mentioned this earlier, but Tsar Nicholas II is cousins to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and yet they're fighting against each other. They didn't really want to go to war against each other. They're friends; they'd grown up together, but they in the end did go to war against each other, and both sides suffered tremendously. Russia really suffered the most, though, and so not only do you have the war going really badly, and there's food shortages, and people are sick, and so forth, but before the Tsar is forced to relinquish power, another aspect has also really got him in the disfavor of the Russian people. and that is Rasputin. Rasputin is he claims to be this mystic holy man with special healing powers and so forth. In reality, the guy's a drunk, a womanizer. He's into all kinds of problems. He's just a slug, okay, on society. But he he was rumored to have these healing powers, and what happened was um, the czar and his wife, their son, the youngest kid of theirs, their son, um, he was sickly, and he was a hemophiliac, which meant if he started bleeding, he couldn't stop. Well, one day Rasputin happens to be around, and the boy starts bleeding, and Rasputin does something, and the boy stops bleeding. Well, the Tsarina, okay, the queen, immediately then says, "Well, whoa, this guy has some kind of magical powers. I got to keep him around." Well, eventually the Tsarina then would start taking advice from Rasputin, and Tsar Nicholas would listen to him, and Tsar Nicholas kind of, weasels his way into the royal palace and starts becoming almost an advisor to the royal family, and I mean, and who would hang out with this guy, right? And he does nothing but lead the royal family down the wrong path. And when the Russian people find out that Rasputin is kind of in the good graces of the royal family, well, of course, uh, the people aren't going to be happy with the royal family. And so all these things combined lead to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Uh, and tragically, though, they are taken and they are taken into a room of a residence, and they're all gunned down to death. They're all killed. Of course, the Anastasia story, the movie by Disney, says that she lived, right, and claims that she survived somehow and lived. And the real story is that nobody lived through that. It doesn't appear. If you see all the walls that are just have bullet holes all through them, I don't think anybody could survive that. So uh, that is how the royal family ends up. And eventually, Rasputin, even though those his enemies tried to kill him numerous ways, from everywhere from gunshots to poisonings to you name it. None of it seems to work. Eventually, he's also killed, and so the old guard, so to speak, is out in Russia, and a new government comes in. When that new government comes in, they pull Russia out of the war, and uh, and that's why then Russia is not in the war the last couple of years. Well, the Allies, especially France and England, really needed some help by 1917. They really needed a boost. They needed supplies. Uh, they needed fresh troops to help them, and they didn't really have those things in their own countries. And it's just in the nick of time that the United States enters the war. General John J. Pershing was our main U.S. general in World War I, and the American soldier in World War I was known as a doughboy. This is the nickname for the American soldier. And the doughboys show up in Europe just in time. They get off the trains. The doughboys, the Americans, are optimistic, full of uh, youthful verve, and they're ready to fight. And it's how the French and the British and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians felt a couple years earlier, right? And then they realized real quick it wasn't so glorious. But the Americans are untouched by that at first, and they come in and they are exactly what the Allies needed, and they eventually are able to wear down what's left of the German and Austro-Hungarian armies, and the Americans are able to help the Allies in the end win the war. One aspect of the American military that sometimes gets overlooked was uh, the African American presence and how effective they were. In fact, the 369th Infantry Regiment uh, got the nickname the Harlem Hellfighters because they were an all-black unit that were one of the best fighting groups in all of World War One. In fact, the U.S. military was segregated, so blacks and whites didn't fight together, and a lot of times the blacks were um, asked to do things off the front lines. They weren't even allowed to fight a whole lot usually. They were cooks or they were whatever, right? And the French said, "Oh, wait a minute here. Where we're at, we need help." we'll take your African American groups, and you send them to us, and they can fight with us. And so some of them did that, including the Harlem Hellfighters, and for their amazing uh, effectiveness in battle, they end up receiving France's highest combat medal, which is called the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, and uh, and so fantastic. Okay, but that was definitely an element of the U.S. military that that needs to be recognized. Meanwhile, back in Russia, a new government has taken over, and uh, Vladimir Lenin is the leader of that new government. He leads a revolution um, to overthrow the temporary government that had been established after the Tsar. And once Lenin and his men take control, he implements communism to Russia. And to this day, he is known as the father of Russian communism. Uh, by some people, he's deemed as a hero, as the father of their nation, but by many, he is seen as a tyrant. So it's just a matter, I guess, of perspective. But and what you think is good and bad and right versus wrong. But he, Vladimir Lenin, he brought that idea of communism to Russia. Of course, it didn't work as he preached it would, and most Russians ended up poor and destitute, uh, you know, hoping to have enough food to eat that day, and trying to stay warm in a freezing cold house during the winter. And so, he plunged Russia basically into communism for 70 years, and um, Russia became known as the Soviet Union. Okay, because they started to conquer uh, during this time as well, started to take over other areas around Russia and add them to their empire. So the Soviet Union um, comes into being. All right, but Vladimir Lenin is the father of Russian communism. Interesting that because he is deemed by some to be this heroic, uh, introducer of communism in Russia, the Russians, when he died, the Russians basically kind of they they encased his body in like an airtight glass case, and he's still on display. You can go into a room, and there's like this spotlight shining down on him, and there's Russian guards with their guns all over the place to make sure you don't get too close to the tomb. But you can walk around the tomb and look at the dead, long dead, and very slowly decaying body of Vladimir Lenin. So I'm not going to get into like a lot of the specifics about the major battles and things. There were tremendous battles during World War One, of course, where hundreds of thousands, even millions of men were involved. Um, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun, things like that. Uh, but I want to focus more on the statistics. Once the Americans joined the Allied forces, eventually, like I said, they're able to wear down the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, the Central Powers. They're able to we just have the supplies and we have the men, and we're able to overpower uh, the opponent. But by the time World War One is finished, people are just it. The numbers are staggering. People are amazed when you stop and look at what the results were. They estimate that over 65 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen were involved in World War One. Over 8 million military deaths as a result of this war, and over 6.5 million civilian deaths worldwide. Uh, they estimate over 21 million wounded military personnel in World War One. So if you start looking at the statistics, I mean, these are just unbelievable, eye-popping numbers, right? And a whole generation of young men was eliminated or wounded, sometimes beyond recognition. Okay, and can you imagine? Can you imagine just almost a whole generation of a certain age group just being almost gone, wiped out? And that's what happened in World War One. Like I had mentioned before, part of what helps the U.S. in the war is the Liberty Bond movement, the bond movement. They call it Liberty Bonds, um, because we're preserving liberty, right? So again, more posters and things to buy bonds. Americans could buy them, give money to the government now in with a promise that you would get your money back plus interest down the road. But these bonds are sold all over the country to support the Allied cause. While the First World War is happening, here in the U.S., there is a fear of espionage. Americans thought they were being spied on, by the enemy or traitorous Americans, and so there is always that aspect of, you know, you have some German American neighbors or Austrian American neighbors or whatever, and hey, are you a spy? Are they really an enemy? And we would see that again in World War II on a larger scale, with the Japanese Americans and with the Italian Americans and German Americans. But there is a fear of espionage during World War One. How much espionage was happening? Probably very little uh, in the grand scheme of things. But of course, people get paranoid about stuff, and so especially when there's a war going on, you have to be a little more careful what you say and how loud you say it and so forth. But uh, this is something that's happening here in the United States. There's also a new workforce during the First World War. That most of the young white Americans are off fighting. So African Americans step into the workforce in larger numbers than ever before. And women step into the workforce in huge numbers, and other minorities as well. And so this is going to create an interesting dynamic because once the war ends, these people are working in these spots that had previously been occupied by the now returning soldiers many times, and it becomes an issue of who the boss is going to, is he going to keep his current workforce? Is he going to hire back, that veteran soldier, or what's he going to do? And so this is going to create some tension, especially between some racial tension in certain places too, when a lot of these guys come back looking for their old jobs, and maybe African Americans or other minorities are in those jobs. So, but a new workforce occurs, and so it gives people that maybe hadn't been in the workforce as much. It gives them a taste of getting a regular paycheck and a little better living. So when the war ends, it ends, but it doesn't end. Okay, if that makes sense. Here's what I mean by that: the war will officially be over. The guns will stop. The Allies have defeated the Central Powers, and Europe is in shambles. The people are destitute. The countries are broke. Landscapes are transformed, changed. Okay, the the wounded and sick will be haunting every city in Europe for years to come. Europe is devastated. Okay, farmlands and fields and bridges and roads and houses are all leveled, and so the world looks to the victors, the allies, especially the United States, as to, what are we going to do now? And our president, Woodrow Wilson, said, hey, I have a bunch of ideas for the post-war world. I want to set things up a certain way. In fact, he had 14 points, as he called them, for ideas about post-war Europe and the world. But his crowning point of those 14 was what he called his League of Nations. He wanted to set up an organization of countries that would work together to promote security and peace. But really, it sounds good on paper. Uh, it was really kind of an attempt at world government in a way, uh, in its early stages. And it was a forerunner to the United Nations today. But this League of Nations is accepted by some countries. Some countries say, yeah, we'll join up, especially these European countries who are like, yeah, we're so war torn. We need help. We need other people, to kind of come in and you know and prop us up a little bit. And if we can make alliances with other countries who can help us out and do those kind of things, that's great. But uh, the American Senate, the United States Senate, refused to ratify this treaty. So the United States never actually joined it. And Woodrow Wilson was heartbroken about that. But whether that was a good move or not on the U.S. Senate part, that's an opinion, but that everybody might have. But that's what the League of Nations was. And so it started. It did exist. It's just the U.S. never joined it, but other countries did. And here you can see the members of the League of Nations. Quite a few countries do join, right? So when the peace talks start after the war, they're going to happen over in Versailles, France, just outside of Paris. And of course, the United States, again, is all eyes are on the U.S. and President Wilson. And President Wilson is deemed kind of a hero, in France and stuff because of his League of Nations idea, his 14 points. And, and you'll see why as well that the U.S. was kind of seen in a better light um, than some other countries after the war as a result of the peace treaty. But the big four, US, Britain, France, and now Italy. Now you're saying, wait a minute, Italy was a central power. They were when the war started. About halfway through, they said, hey, I think we're going to switch sides. So the victors, the major victors in the war, constitute these big four countries. They're the ones that dominate the peace treaty talks. The losers, Germany, Austria Hungary, they're left out. They're destitute, they're broke, they're bankrupt, everything as well, but they're going to be kicked while they're down. And you're going to see that in just a second. But the big four are the ones that dominate the peace treaty talks. Well, the leader of one of those big four, France, was George Clemenceau. And he was very vocal about harsh penalties against Germany. He looked at Germany as the aggressor in this war, that it was kind of because of them that it started, he said. And he wants to punish Germany. He wants to make it so they will never be able to wage war again. And of course, we know that's not going to happen. They are going to wage war again, and they're going to be a juggernaut in World War II. But part of the reason that Germany becomes the juggernaut they do, and that Hitler insists on building up the military as strong as he did, was because of how Germany was treated after World War I. And so Clemenceau says we're going to have harsh penalties against Germany. We're going to take away overseas colonies. We're going to cut into the country of Germany and make some new countries, and so give Germany less territory. We're going to limit the German military to make sure they can't fight anymore. I mean, it was literally, a punch to the gut after you've already been, kicked in the head. Okay, and so he is not merciful at all toward Germany. So, like I mentioned previously, two new countries are formed after World War, or as a result of World War I and the peace talks: Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. They will be on the map of Europe for a number of years, and you can see that chunks are taken out of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be kind of broken up, and like I said, and Germany loses part of its territory as well, so these new countries can be formed. And so these are penalties. These are part of the penalties toward the Central Powers that the Allies demand as a result of the war. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of England. Of course, England's one of the big four, and they dominate the peace talks. He piggybacks on what Clemenceau of France wanted, and he wants to really punish Germany as well. And he demands reparations, payment for war damages. He says Germany, owes them, Germany owes them just an unspeakable amount of money. Okay, and Germany says, well, we don't have any money. We don't have $5. Okay, we can't be paying reparations to anybody. And David Lloyd George and Clemenceau said, we don't care. You'll pay us back over time. In fact, they demanded $33 billion back then from Germany, and Germany didn't have $3, right? The German money was so devalued and worth nothing. It took a wheelbarrow full of German money to buy a loaf of bread. Okay, but Germany is just hammered, destroyed by France and England in these peace talks. Now, the U.S. wanted to be a little more merciful, but unfortunately, France and England are going to get most of what they want as far as penalties toward Germany after the war. This is going to create lasting bitterness on the part of Germany, and you're going to see why then when Hitler, like I said, when Hitler has built up this massive military and he's going to launch his invasions, you can see why he's particularly brutal against France and England during World War II. So, like I said, the Versailles Treaty is the peace treaty that ends World War I. It's officially signed in 1919, And the end result is that it leads to bitterness and contempt among the European countries. Instead of getting along, instead of trying to, somehow avoid future conflicts, talk out their problems, it just creates this tenseness. It creates this negative, these negative feelings that these European countries have toward each other. And within 20 years, you're going to have another world war, right, as a result. And you can see the leaders then, of course, David Lloyd George of England on the far left, Clemenceau, who looks like Mr. Peanut there, uh, of France in the middle, and Woodrow Wilson on the right. To finish World War One, then talking about it, interesting couple of quotes I think are really pretty poignant, pretty on target. One of them says, when compared to World War One, it has been said that World War One was nevertheless a conflict marked by stalemate and slaughter, rather than movement and conquest. Animated by nationalist fervor, world-embracing idealism, and self-sacrificing patriotism, it was nevertheless characterized far more deeply by misery than by heroism. World War II was ultimately far bloodier, but not more dismal. And World War I is an end and a beginning. It is the sharp, violent, unspeakably violent end of the old world, and it is the equally violent beginning of the new world. And again, I think both of them, both those quotes are on point. Pretty crazy when you look at World War One and just just can you imagine being a soldier in World War One and just really just the hopelessness after you got in and all that idealism is shattered when the first day when you see your buddy die, type thing. And you're saying, wait, but this isn't supposed to happen. We're supposed to all go back heroes, right? And I could die in this thing? What? And can you imagine then being in the war for another 2 or 3 years or whatever and just living in a trench and just unbelievable. So crazy, crazy how World War One worked out, crazy how it started, but that is World War One.